So that was Jeremiah prophesying about 700 years before Jesus was born. Prophesying on the edge of the exile of the people of Israel to Babylon. And you probably remember that by now Israel has split into two kingdoms, the northern kingdom called Israel and the southern kingdom called Judah. But the northern kingdom has been conquered already by the Assyrians, so it's gone. So all we have is that small southern kingdom where Jerusalem is located. Now, as I spent this past week reading about Jeremiah and getting ready for today, I became more and more convinced that Jeremiah doesn't actually fit in this sermon series we've been doing. What was I thinking is what I kept thinking. It is Jeremiah's solid faithfulness to God that actually gets him into trouble. But he doesn't get in trouble with God. He gets in trouble with people. You know, shooting the messenger is kind of like a universal theme. It's a universal shortcoming. It's found in every people, in every society, in every era. Jeremiah experienced this. Jesus experienced this. We witness it often today, do we not? Whistleblowers, truth tellers, doctors who tell us, change your habits. We cover our ears, we ignore what they say, we wait for them to go away, if only they would. You know, the last several weeks here, you and I have been talking about Bible personalities who, they really mess up somewhere in their ministry. They break a big rule somewhere along the line, and yet God still uses them. Maybe even God uses them because they've messed up and because they've been somewhere bad and because they have something special to bring to the rest of the work that they're going to do for God. But Jeremiah does not fit that picture. He doesn't fit that mold. Jeremiah speaks and acts in powerful ways for God at God's instructions and does what God says. He says the unwelcome word to power. Power is not happy. Jeremiah directs the people. He directs the government to do what God says, even if it sounds counterintuitive. Cooperate with Babylon, Jeremiah said. In performing faithfully for God, Jeremiah gets in great trouble with the people and with the governing officials. His faithful voice sets him up as an authoritative speaker for God, an authoritative witness, even as nobody wants to hear what he has to say, even as they try to destroy him for saying it. Now you remember that Israel is a small nation. They're located geographically at a crossroads between Central Asia and between North Africa. And all the travelers and all the traders and all the militaries want to go through this little space of territory as Judah. And so everybody wants to control this space. That is where Judah sits. Judah is always at risk of being taken over by someone. And so at some point, for good or ill, Judah made a deal with Babylon from the north. We'll send you money, you take care of and protect us. But then they started to wonder, maybe if we talk to the Egyptians down to the southeast, or southwest, we might get a better deal. They've already made a covenant with Babylon, but maybe we can get a bigger deal with the Egyptians. And so they start something of a bidding war, pitting one neighbor against another, pitting one alliance against another. From which one could we get the most favors? But it's Jeremiah's conviction that if you are in covenant with God, then you must maintain any other covenants you also make. You must be the first one to keep other promises you make. So when King Jehoiakim takes out the scroll of the law, the scroll that was found when they were renovating the temple, King Jehoiakim takes out this scroll and he burns it up in flames. Jeremiah sees the king as thumbing his nose at God, thumbing his nose at the covenant between Israel and God. Jeremiah feels as if creation itself has been uncreated, as if all the promises made through Abraham have been reversed or taken away. When the scroll is burned, Judah, the nation of Judah, loses its integrity as a nation. It loses its integrity as a people of God. Judah rejects some of the most basic and most cherished spiritual convictions. Judah steps further into the world of idolatry, of ingratitude, of folly, of immorality, of spiritual adultery. Judah prefers the false prophets in place of the message from God's prophets like Jeremiah. Judah slanders God. Judah disobediently rebels. Judah fails to provide justice for the poor. And Judah slights the alliance with God by taking on pagan gods. One of Judah's pagan gods is that of nationalism. Judah puts nation above God, puts nation above the greatest commandment of love God, love neighbor, love self, love God with everything you have. Judah puts nation first. And that God, that idol, is exposed as being separate from God. Just like 700 years later, the cross would expose Israel's, again, idol of nationalism. Now, the nationalism of first century Israel would be broken by the Romans. And the nationalism, idolism of Judah would be broken by Babylon. You and I have known of nationalistic fervors, of nationalistic idols can be broken, such as when Germany and Italy and Spain and Japan put nationalism first. And we broke it with wars and establishing democracies. As nationalistic fervor again grows today, again becomes a viable and active God, I wonder what will break that fervor so we can again be a people of God first. Jeremiah's task was to warn of the judgment to come. But his task was also to assure people that there's hope. There is something to look forward to in the long run. Since they had made a covenant with Babylon, it would be in Judah's best interest to honor that covenant. Go along with what Babylon demanded. Avoid the chaos that would ensue if you fought against Babylon. Avoid the absolute destruction that would happen if you decided to break an agreement. But the people don't want to listen to Jeremiah. What Jeremiah suggested that they do did not look familiar, and you and I both know how hard it is to do things that are brand new. We've always done it this way. We refuse to change. They don't want to dismantle their known hierarchies and social structures. They cannot understand that God doesn't require that worship and faith rituals be practiced the same way forever and ever and ever. That one can be faithful to God even in new ways. It's unfathomable to Judah that God is not permanently committed to Judah's religious practices. That Judah's royalty doesn't need to be royalty anymore. That Judah's leaders don't need to be leaders anymore. That the wealth that Judah's elite has doesn't have to stay there. That it can be distributed so that Judah doesn't have the poverty that could come about over time. Judah also has excuses for how they treat the poor and the marginalized. You know, we don't have time to take care of those people. We don't have the time and energy to do what God wants us to do. You see, we're busy doing our devotions. We're busy doing our prayers. We are busy taking care of each other in our faith community. Maybe someday we'll get to those outside the walls. And we especially don't have time, they said, to speak to power. We don't have time to stand up for the weak and the oppressed. We just have time to talk to God and each other. They don't recognize the idolatry of their pagan deities and the pagan values and pagan ways. So Jeremiah urges them, do things differently. Do things differently than you have been. Work with Babylon and see what you can make happen. Work with Babylon and try to avoid the war and the social upheaval and the economic hardship that might come about otherwise. But the Jerusalem establishment is no pro-Babylonian policies. It opposes any script that would compromise national autonomy. Any script that opposes national autonomy, even if it's more faithful to God. Even after the first exilees have been taken away. Oh, it's just a temporary thing, they tell us. It won't last. But for the royals and the leaders, resisting is the only thing they know. They're unable to consider alternate ideas. They insist on doing things their way, the way they've always done it. And they watch as their brightest and their best are taken away to live in captivity in Babylon. They watch as their best are taken away and given new names, Babylonian names, and new gods, Babylonian gods. They watch as what remains behind is evidence of a destroyed civilization. The exile would last 70 years. That's more than 2 generations. It's time for all those who had ever lived in Israel, who knew what happened firsthand, to pass away. When it comes time for them to return, there's nobody left who knew what it once was like. And some who are left don't want to return. Remember, Jeremiah is the messenger. We shoot messengers when we don't like the message, even if the message is God sent. We lash out, we strike back, we ridicule the messenger, we discount them, we undermine their credibility, and we sling mud. We've seen that this past week, have we not? We sling mud, except in Jeremiah's case, we slung Jeremiah into the mud gently, because we don't want to be criticized for hurting him when we throw him into the mud. Lower and gently. Watch him sink. Quickly walk away and forget about him. Maybe he'll starve to death while we're busy elsewhere. The people, Jeremiah, even God, they're all devastated by what happens when Babylon conquers. The people feel abandoned by each other. They feel abandoned by God. They grieve the loss of their beloved way of life, the loss of their autonomy as a nation. They grieve their temple and its symbolism as a place to connect with God. And doubts overwhelm them. Who is to blame for this mass disruption of life, they ask. Does the dismantling of Judah signal the impotence or injustice of God? Has God abandoned God's people or reneged on past promises? How can such massive devastation and widespread violence possibly happen in a meaningfully moral world, a morally meaningful world? Is the devastation permanent? And what kind of future is possible? Even in the midst of his own feelings of abandonment, Jeremiah is able to reach hope. Joan read to us about how he buys that property, he buys that vineyard. Why would you buy property in a place where everybody's leaving? It's because he knew that someday, they would return. Jeremiah knew that life was not out of God's control. Jeremiah knew that God was not impotent in the face of raw geopolitical forces. Jeremiah knew that the suffering wasn't meaningless. He knew that, as the scriptures tell us, God was plucking down so that God could build back up. God was using this situation to destroy and overthrow the things that had become sacred cows in people's midst, so that they could rebuild a more faithful kingdom dedicated to God. All this means that God reigns despite the chaos, despite the violence, despite the war, despite the forced displacement of people. God still reigns. God is still king. When Babylon overthrows Judah, God also grieves. God's people ignored God and turned their backs on God. God's heart must have been broken. The people did not believe that God sent word through Jeremiah, and so they shut their ears to what he said. They did not believe his words that it would be better to cooperate with Babylon. But despite the pain that God's own self must have felt, God stays with Jeremiah. God stays with the exiles as they go to Babylon. And God remains with the remnant, the faithful remnant that stays behind in Judah. Today, whatever turmoil you and I face as individuals or as a nation, however alone we feel, God stays with us. God doesn't back off and watch us suffer and say, let's see how they handle that. God instead gets closer and closer to us until God is even closer to ourselves than we are. And God knows us better than we know our own self. God joins us in experiencing our comfort, our discomfort, our confusion, and our pain. And God grieves with us when we lose. God meets us in the crucible of our pain. And because God is there with us, we can be brave just like Jeremiah. Even though Jeremiah felt abandoned, he also felt emboldened. And he was able to speak up. And he was saying, don't do this. It's not faithful. Listen to God. These are the words God says. In Jesus' eyes, we should be as bold as Jeremiah. And Jesus should be able to make us that bold if we will be in touch with Jesus. Like Jeremiah, like Jesus, we can speak up to power, even to government, and urge them to do things that love God and that love neighbor. In our situation, we might not be able to say, government, you need to do this because of God. But we can certainly name godly things to our government. Jeremiah's message holds out hope that even today, even in the worst scenario, including reading through the eyes of New Testament believers and followers of Jesus, if we have kept our Christian faith locked up tight in a Ziploc bag so that nothing of government or politics can get into it, Jeremiah is our role model for breaking that zipper and getting out and promoting God's values of justice and integrity and faithfulness. You know, in some ways, Jeremiah's work looked like a waste of time. It certainly didn't accomplish what he was supposed to be doing then. But he's been vindicated. After all, he shows up in the scriptures. And the scriptures tell us that what he said was right. That Babylon did destroy them. But also that there's hope and there's something for the future. And that God's covenant with us will not be broken by God. So as Jesus followers, let us be committed to being as bold as Jesus, as bold as Jeremiah, and speaking up and bringing God's kingdom here, now, as it is in heaven. Amen.